The widow who sang at midnight, the village of Graythorn Hollow, lay folded into the rolling hills of southern England like a well-loved shawl, faded at the edges, comforting in its familiarity, and hiding more than one carefully mended tear. Narrow lanes curved politely around ancient hedgerows. Cottages leaned companionably towards one another as if sharing secrets, and the church spire of St. Mildred's rose with mild authority above them all, its stone bells having regulated village life for over 3 centuries. On a clear autumn afternoon in 1954, the air smelled faintly of fallen apples, coal smoke, and damp wool. The leaves had begun their gentle descent, and with them came the quiet inward turn of village life, fires lit earlier, curtains drawn sooner, gossip thickening like stew. It was precisely the sort of place Miss Jane Marple found most instructive. She had arrived 3 weeks earlier, ostensibly to stay with her old friend Mrs. Eliza Banting, whose rheumatism had improved dramatically since she discovered that complaining about it to visitors was more therapeutic than any salve. Miss Marple, small and upright despite her years, had settled into the spare bedroom overlooking the green with her usual unobtrusive efficiency. Within days she knew which roses were failing, whose hens had stopped laying, and which marriages were quietly unhappy. Graythorn Hollow, she observed to herself, was much like St. Mary Mead, except where it was different, and it was always the differences that mattered. The widow at Rosevale Cottage, at the edge of the village green, stood Rosevale Cottage, a charming but slightly melancholy house with pale blue shutters and an overgrown garden that suggested neglect rather than poverty. It belonged to Mrs. Lydia Fairclough, the widow who sang at midnight. Lydia Fairclough had been a topic of conversation since the day she arrived in Graythorn Hollow 18 months earlier, following the sudden death of her husband, Edmund Fairclough, a retired shipping accountant whose affairs, financial and otherwise, had been described by the solicitor as complex but not improper. Mrs. Fairclough herself was a tall, willowy woman in her early 40s, with dark hair worn in a loose coil at the nape of her neck, and eyes of an uncertain colour, hazel perhaps or grey, depending on the light and her mood. She dressed with quiet elegance, favouring muted tones and soft fabrics, and spoke in a low, musical voice that carried surprisingly far, and she sang, not in public, not at church, nor at fêtes or gatherings. But some nights, never predictable, never announced, her voice would rise from Rosevale Cottage some time after midnight. It drifted across the green, through open windows and thin curtains, haunting and sorrowful. Old ballads, laments, once unmistakably an aria from Dido and Aeneas. Some villagers found it beautiful, others found it unsettling. All of them talked about it. She sings like she's calling someone back from the grave. Mrs. Banting remarked one afternoon, passing Miss Marple a plate of seed cake. Miss Marple accepted the cake with gratitude. Yes, she said mildly, that sort of thing often suggests unresolved feelings, or occasionally a desire to be noticed. Mrs. Banting sniffed. Well, if she wants attention, she's certainly got it. A village of watchful eyes among those particularly attentive to Mrs. Fairclough were several figures who would later become relevant. There was Mr. Harold Quince, the village chemist, a thin man with meticulously combed hair, and a manner so precise it bordered on anxious. His shop on the high street sold remedies, toiletries, and an impressive array of tonics, all of which he could describe in exhausting detail. Mr. Quince had been seen on more than one occasion walking Lydia Fairclough home from evening committee meetings. Then there was Mrs. Beatrice Linton, chairwoman of the Greythorn Hollow Women's Guild, whose sharp eyes missed very little, and whose mouth rarely forgot what it had once tasted of scandal, Mrs. Linton had taken an immediate dislike to Lydia Fairclough, describing her as altogether too dramatic for a village like ours. "You never know what such women are hiding," she told Miss Marple over tea, with the air of one imparting a moral truth. Miss Marple merely smiled and asked for another biscuit. Dr. Philip Hawthorne, the village GP, was another frequent visitor to Rosevale Cottage. A man in his late 30s, brisk, capable, and widely admired, he had attended Edmund Fairclough during his final illness and continued to check in on the widow's nerves. And finally there was Mr. Arthur Bell, Lydia's late husband's nephew, a quiet, bookish man in his late 20s, who had come to Greythorn Hollow from London to assist with estate matters. He lodged at the Crown and Thistle, and spent long hours walking the lanes, usually alone. Miss Marple noticed all of them. She always did. The night of the song, the night that changed everything, was unseasonably cold. A sharp wind rattled windows and sent leaves scurrying like guilty thoughts along the lanes. Miss Marple had gone to bed early, her knitting folded neatly beside her. Sometime after midnight she awoke, not suddenly, but with the gentle awareness that something had disturbed the quiet. Then she heard it. Singing, clearer than usual, stronger, not sorrowful this time, but urgent, almost triumphant. Miss Marple sat up slightly in bed, listening. The song was unfamiliar, though it bore the shape of an old folk tune. The final note lingered in the air, unresolved, and then silence. No gradual fading, no echoing refrain, just an abrupt end. Miss Marple frowned. "That's odd," she murmured to the darkness. She lay awake for some time after, her mind gently rearranging impressions like pieces of wool being sorted by colour. Eventually she slept. In the morning Greythorn Hollow woke to sirens. The discovery it was Mrs. Pritchard, the postmistress, who found the body. She had gone to Rosevale Cottage just after 8 o'clock, carrying a registered letter that required a signature. Receiving no answer to her knock, she tried the door, which opened. Mrs. Pritchard screamed. By 8:30, the village green was dotted with small clusters of people, speaking in hushed voices. A police car stood awkwardly near the duck pond. Curtains twitched. Lydia Fairclough was dead. She lay at the foot of the narrow staircase inside Rosevale Cottage, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm bent beneath her. Her dressing gown was neatly tied. There was no sign of struggle. The initial verdict, offered with professional caution by Sergeant Colin Reeves, was a tragic accident. She must have fallen, he said. Stairs can be dangerous, but accidents, Miss Marple knew, were often the most suspicious of all. Miss Marple observes Miss Marple heard the news from Mrs. Banting, who burst into the sitting-room with breathless excitement that barely concealed genuine shock. "Jane, it's dreadful, simply dreadful. Poor Mrs. Fairclough, dead as you please." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Indeed," she said quietly. "How was she found? At the bottom of her stairs. They say she slipped in the night." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened slightly. "Do they?" Mrs. Banting leaned closer. "Between you and me, Jane, it all seems very queer, especially after that singing." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "especially after that." Later that morning she walked slowly past Rosevale Cottage, ostensibly to admire the last of the autumn flowers. She noted the position of the windows, the narrowness of the staircase visible through the open door, the absence of any broken objects. She also noted who was there. Mr. Harold Quince stood near the gate, wringing his hands. Mrs. Linton spoke animatedly to Dr. Hawthorne, her eyes bright with something perilously close to satisfaction. Arthur Bell lingered apart, pale and withdrawn. Everyone, Miss Marple observed, reacted exactly as they always did when something dreadful occurred. And that, she reflected, was precisely the problem. A question of song by afternoon, the rumour mill had reached a furious pace. She was distraught. Said one voice, she was happier than she'd been in months. Said another, I always said that singing would lead to no good. Miss Marple sat quietly at the Crown and Thistle, listening. The landlady, Mrs. Gibbons, lowered her voice conspiratorially. Funny thing, Miss Marple, Mr. Bell says his aunt was expecting someone last night. Oh, Miss Marple looked interested. Did she say who? Mrs. Gibbons shook her head. No, just that she had a visitor coming. Miss Marple stirred her tea. A visitor, a song at midnight, a sudden fall, patterns like people revealed themselves in time. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple felt that familiar tightening of certainty, not yet knowledge, but instinct. Greythorn Hollow had lost its widow, but it had gained a mystery, and Miss Jane Marple, as ever, intended to sing it through to the final note. Quiet questions and louder silences in Greythorn Hollow, the day after a death, was always the most revealing. The shock had worn thin, like a coat left too long in the rain, and beneath it lay curiosity, judgment, and occasionally relief. Doors were opened a little more cautiously, voices lowered a shade, and everyone remembered something they had not thought important the day before. Miss Jane Marple, knitting bag on her arm, stepped into the village street shortly after 10 o'clock, and observed these subtle shifts with calm attentiveness. She had found over the years that people rarely lied outright. Instead, they selected which truths to present and which to quietly misplace. The police had been efficient, courteous, and, in Miss Marple's experience, inclined towards simplicity. A fall down the stairs, an unfortunate widow, a tragic accident, but simplicity, she knew, was often an indulgence. The house on the green Rosevale cottage had been closed since the previous afternoon, its pale blue shutters drawn tight. A small bunch of chrysanthemums lay by the gate, white and yellow, neatly arranged. Miss Marple paused to look at them. From the Women's Guild, she murmured to herself, a little premature, perhaps. She turned away and continued towards the High Street, where the village chemist's shop stood between the post office and the haberdashery. A bell tinkled softly as she entered. Mr. Harold Quince looked up from behind the counter with a start. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in." "No, indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "One rarely does if one is listening to one's own thoughts." Mr. Quince flushed faintly. "I wondered." Miss Marple continued, selecting a small tin of barley sugar, "whether you might advise me on something for Mrs. Banting's digestion. She's been rather unsettled since yesterday." "Quite understandable," said Mr. Quince quickly. "Shock can upset the system terribly." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "shock can do many things." She paid and lingered, as if uncertain whether to leave. "You knew Mrs. Fairclough rather well, didn't you?" she asked gently. Mr. Quince's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "Well, yes, that is, I dispensed her prescriptions, of course, and occasionally walked her home after meetings. Entirely proper, I assure you." "I should never doubt it," Miss Marple replied. "Did she seem herself recently?" He hesitated. She was animated, more than usual, almost excited. "About anything in particular?" Mr. Quince swallowed. "No, she didn't say." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "People often don't. Tea with the doctor. Philip Hawthorne's surgery occupied a neat brick building just beyond the green. Miss Marple called that afternoon under the pretext of delivering a jar of Mrs. Banting's blackberry jam. How thoughtful of you. The doctor said, ushering her into his consulting room. "Mrs. Banting's preserves are famous. She considers them medicinal. Miss Marple said, 'I understand you were attending Mrs. Fairclough.' Yes." His tone shifted, professional but guarded. "She suffered from bouts of anxiety, insomnia, nothing uncommon in widows. Did she ever express fear?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Hawthorne considered. "Fear, no. Anticipation, perhaps." "Of what?" He shook his head. "She didn't say, but she asked me only last week whether a shock could kill a person outright." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And what did you tell her? That it depended on the shock?" He said slowly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "it always does. Mrs. Linton speaks freely. If information were currency, Mrs. Beatrice Linton would have been the Bank of England." Miss Marple found her at home, presiding over a pot of tea and an air of grim satisfaction. "I always said something like this would happen," Mrs. Linton announced before Miss Marple had even sat down. "Mark my words, Jane, women who sing at midnight are not to be trusted." "Really?" said Miss Marple mildly. "I've known several who were perfectly harmless." Mrs. Linton waved a dismissive hand. She enjoyed the attention, that's what it was. Poor Edmund Fairclough barely cold in his grave, and she carrying on like an opera singer. "Did you know Mr. Fairclough well?" Miss Marple asked. "Well enough," Mrs. Linton said sharply. "He was a quiet man, easily led." "Led by whom?" Mrs. Linton leaned forward. "His wife, of course." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And after his death?" Mrs. Linton's eyes glittered. "I don't believe she was as alone as she pretended." "Do you have any reason to think so?" Mrs. Linton smiled thinly. "One always has reasons, dear Jane. One simply chooses when to share them. Arthur Bell was not difficult to find." He sat in the Crown and Thistle's small parlour, staring at an untouched cup of tea. Miss Marple approached quietly. "May I join you, Mr. Bell?" He looked up, startled. "Oh, yes, of course. I'm very sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "Thank you." His voice was flat. Aunt Lydia was complicated. "Most people are," said Miss Marple. "Did she seem troubled lately?" He hesitated. "She said she'd made a mistake, years ago, one that was coming back to her." "Did she say what the mistake was?" "No." He rubbed his forehead. "She said she intended to put it right, last night." Miss Marple nodded slowly, and the singing, a faint smile touched his lips. She always sang when she was nervous. A policeman's certainty sergeant, Colin Reeves, called on Miss Marple the following morning, hat in hand. "Just routine, miss," he said. "You were in the vicinity?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I often am. We're satisfied it was an accident." He continued, "But if you heard or saw anything unusual—" "I heard singing," Miss Marple said. "Yes, well, that's been noted. It stopped suddenly." He shrugged. "People stop singing. Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, "sometimes something stops them." He smiled politely. "If you think of anything else, do let us know." Miss Marple watched him go. Threads begin to show by the end of the week. The funeral had been arranged, condolences paid, and Graythorne Hollow had begun its slow return to routine. But Miss Marple's mind was busy. A woman anticipating a visitor. A song sung with unusual intensity. A fall that left no marks of panic, and beneath it all a sense she could not quite articulate, that Lydia Fairclough had not been afraid of dying. She had been afraid of living with what she knew. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "There are secrets in this village," she murmured, "and one of them has just fallen down the stairs. Songs, secrets, and the shape of deceit. If Graythorne Hollow believed it had settled after the funeral, it was mistaken." Outwardly, the village resumed its habits. The Women's Guild met as scheduled. The bells of St. Mildred's rang on Sunday morning. The Crown and Thistle served shepherd's pie on Thursdays, as it always had. Yet beneath the surface something restless stirred, like water disturbed by a stone, the ripples spreading long after the initial splash. Miss Jane Marple felt it keenly. She had learned, over many years, that murder rarely announced itself boldly. It preferred suggestion, silence, an absence where something ought to be, and Lydia Fairclough's absence was beginning to speak very loudly indeed. The will that changed everything, the first ripple, arrived in the form of a solicitor. Mr. Henry Aldridge, a sober man with pins, Nez and a briefcase that smelled faintly of leather and old paper, summoned Arthur Bell and several interested parties to his office above the post office. Miss Marple did not attend. She rarely did, but she heard all about it by tea-time. Mrs. Bunting arrived flushed with excitement. Jane, you'll never guess. Lydia Fairclough changed her will. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Recently, 3 days before she died. Yes, said Miss Marple quietly. That would be about right. The new will left the bulk of Lydia Fairclough's modest estate not to her nephew Arthur, as had long been assumed, but to a charitable trust for displaced war widows, with one exception. A personal bequest of £1,000 had been left to Harold Quince. The village reacted exactly as one might expect. Mrs. Linton called it disgraceful. Arthur Bell looked stunned. Mr. Quince went pale and shut his shop for the afternoon. Miss Marple merely nodded. A gift, she murmured, or a payment. The chemist under scrutiny. Mr. Quince's shop became suddenly very popular. People required tonic, lozenges, liniment, any excuse to observe him more closely. Miss Marple entered quietly on Thursday morning. "I hear you've been left a legacy," she said gently. Mr. Quince flinched. "I didn't ask for it. I told her not to." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," she insisted. "Did she say why?" He hesitated. "She said I'd been helpful." "In what way?" He lowered his voice. She was afraid. "She asked me questions about medicines, about doses." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Poison?" "No," he said sharply. "About sleeping draughts, laudanum, things like that?" For herself, Miss Marple asked. "Yes, no, well, I don't know." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You see, Mr. Quince, uncertainty can be far more dangerous than guilt." When she left she felt no closer to accusing him, but she did feel certain he was hiding something. Whether from her or from himself remained unclear. A song remembered differently. Memory, Miss Marple often reflected, was an unreliable narrator. She had spoken to 6 villagers who had heard Lydia Fairclough sing on the night of her death, and no 2 accounts were quite the same. "It was sad," said Mrs. Pritchard. "It was fierce," said Mr. Dalton, the butcher. "It stopped like someone had slammed a door," said a boy who'd been awake too late. Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Edith Cole, an elderly woman whose cottage overlooked the green. "You know, Mrs. Cole said slowly. It wasn't her usual song. "No," Miss Marple prompted. "She used to sing old love songs. This one, it sounded like a warning." "A warning to whom?" Mrs. Cole shook her head. "Couldn't say, but it made the hairs on my arms stand up." Miss Marple thanked her. Warnings, she reflected, were often issued too late. Dr. Hawthorne's past it was Mrs. Linton, of course, who uncovered the next piece of gossip. "You'll find this interesting, Jane," she said, eyes bright. "Dr. Hawthorne knew Lydia Fairclough before she ever came to Graythorne Hollow." "Did he?" Miss Marple said calmly. "Yes, in London, before the war." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. She called on the doctor that afternoon. "I hear you knew Mrs. Fairclough some years ago," she said. Dr. Hawthorne's expression tightened. "Yes, briefly, socially, professionally. She volunteered at a hospital where I was training." "Did you remain in contact?" No. A pause. Not until she arrived here. Miss Marple studied him. Was her arrival a surprise? He hesitated. Yes. An unpleasant one. He met her gaze. It was. Complicated. Miss Marple nodded. Complication, she knew, was often the polite word for regret. Arthur Bell's alibi, Arthur Bell, had become the quiet centre of speculation. He had argued with his aunt 2 nights before her death. Several people had heard raised voices. Miss Marple spoke to him again, this time on a walk through the lanes. She accused me of wanting her money. He said bitterly, she said I had no right. And did you? He stopped walking. No, I wanted her to tell me the truth. About what? About my mother. Miss Marple waited. She and my mother were estranged. Lydia always said it was my mother's fault. But before she died, she hinted, just once, that she had done something unforgivable. Miss Marple's eyes softened, and she meant to explain it. Yes, last night. Where were you at midnight? Miss Marple asked gently. At the Crown and Thistle. Ask anyone. Indeed, several people confirmed it. Arthur Bell, it seemed, had motive, but no opportunity. A classic red herring, Miss Marple thought. The staircase revisited with permission from Sergeant Reeves. Miss Marple was allowed to revisit Rosevale Cottage before it was emptied. She stood at the top of the narrow staircase, looking down. The carpet was worn but secure. The banister smooth, a fall, yes, but not an easy one. She closed her eyes and imagined it, a woman descending calmly, a pause, a moment of surprise, but not terror. Miss Marple opened her eyes. She wasn't pushed. She murmured. She was persuaded. The letter that never sent the final twist of the week came from the most unlikely source. Mrs. Banting, dusting the spare bedroom Miss Marple occupied, discovered an envelope that had slipped behind a drawer. It was addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." Inside was a letter, unsigned. "I cannot live with what I have done. To-night I will set matters right. If I fail, then know this. The song was not for sorrow, but for courage." Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time, and finally she smiled, very slightly. "Courage," she said. "Yes, that's exactly what it was." The village, however, took the letter quite differently. Suicide, they whispered. Guilt, confession. Sergeant Reeves began to reconsider his conclusions, but Miss Marple shook her head. "No," she said softly, "that isn't it at all." Because Lydia Fairclough had not been planning to die. She had been planning to speak, and someone had made very sure she never did. The courage to speak, and the cost of silence. Miss Jane Marple had always believed that the most dangerous moment in any mystery was not the crime itself, but the instant when truth brushed too close to the surface. People, she knew, would do almost anything to keep the past properly buried. In Greythorn Hollow the past had begun to stir. A pattern emerges. Miss Marple sat by the window in Mrs. Banting's parlour, her knitting untouched. Outside, the village green lay quiet beneath a pale winter sun. Children had been warned not to play near Rosevale Cottage. Adults passed it with polite avoidance, as though death might be catching. She reviewed the facts, not as a list, but as a pattern. Lydia Fairclough had anticipated a confrontation. She had sung, not in sorrow, but in resolve. She had changed her will. She had written a letter meant to survive her courage, should she fail, and she had died in a manner that looked accidental, but felt arranged. "Not suicide," Miss Marple murmured, "and not impulse." She returned inevitably to motive. Fear was everywhere in Greythorn Hollow, but guilt, true guilt, was rarer. Who had the most to lose if Lydia Fairclough spoke? The old hospital record. Miss Marple paid a visit to Miss Elena Price, a retired matron who now lived quietly in the neighbouring village. It was an effort, 2 buses and a short walk, but worth every step. Miss Price remembered Lydia Fairclough at once. A capable woman, she said, quiet but observant. She worked in records. Records, Miss Marple echoed. Yes, admissions, discharges, death certificates. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did anything unusual occur? Miss Price hesitated. There was a young soldier, invalided home, died suddenly, cause heart failure. Miss Price said, but the attending doctor was inexperienced. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Inexperienced doctors often rely on others. Yes, Miss Price said slowly, including volunteers. The doctor's secret doctor. Hawthorne received Miss Marple stiffly. I had hoped, he said, that we might allow the dead to rest. So had Mrs. Fairclough. Miss Marple replied gently. Until she decided she could not. His jaw tightened. She blamed herself. He said, unnecessarily. Did she, Miss Marple asked, or did she blame you? Silence, she knew. He said finally, she found the discrepancy years later, the dosage, the signature. You were newly qualified. Miss Marple said, a mistake. Yes, he said bitterly, one I buried, and Lydia Fairclough discovered it. Miss Marple said, and kept your secret. She owed me nothing, he said, but she stayed silent. Until now. He looked away. She said she could no longer live with it, and you were afraid she would speak. Miss Marple said softly, I begged her not to, but she sang instead. Miss Marple said, a song of courage. The method revealed. Miss Marple turned her attention to the staircase. A fall required imbalance, not force. Dr. Hawthorne's medical bag, she knew, always contained a small vial of fast-acting sedative, not enough to kill, just enough to disorient. Lydia Fairclough had been persuaded to take tea. Tea laced with trust. She would not have panicked. She would have grown dizzy. She would have stepped back instinctively, reaching for a banister just beyond reach. An accident. Only it wasn't. Testing the trap, Miss Marple requested a small gathering at Rosevale Cottage. Sergeant Reeves attended, Arthur Bell, Mr. Quince, Mrs. Linton, Dr. Hawthorne. Miss Marple sat, hands folded, voice gentle. Mrs. Fairclough intended to confess. She said, not to a crime, but to silence. She turned to Doctor. Hawthorne, you made a mistake long ago, she said. One Lydia Fairclough helped you conceal. She meant to expose it, not out of spite, but conscience. Dr. Hawthorne rose. She slipped. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she did. She looked directly at him, after you gave her something to help her sleep. His face drained of colour. You didn't push her. Miss Marple continued. You let nature do the rest. The song explained. She sang. Miss Marple said, because she was afraid, and because she wanted witnesses, not to a murder, but to her resolve. She turned to Arthur Bell. She meant to tell you the truth about your mother, about her own failure. Arthur stared at the floor. And she left Mr. Quince money. Miss Marple said, not as payment, but gratitude. He refused to give her poison. Mr. Quince gasped. The arrest sergeant Reeves stepped forward. Doctor Hawthorne, he said quietly, you are under arrest. The doctor did not resist. I only wanted it to stay buried, he said hoarsely. Miss Marple looked at him with sadness. Buried things, she said, have a way of working loose. Calm restored, the village absorbed the truth slowly. Some were shocked, some vindicated, some disappointed. Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Banting's parlour and picked up her knitting once more. Outside the wind stirred the leaves, and somewhere, Miss Marple thought, Lydia Fairclough's song had finally reached its intended end. When the song is finally heard in Greythorn Hollow, the days following Dr. Hawthorne's arrest unfolded with a curious blend of shock and relief. The truth, once spoken aloud, seemed at first too large for the village to hold. It seeped into conversations at the baker's, into whispered exchanges after church, into the long pauses between sentences. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple had long observed, truth, however unsettling, possessed a calming quality. It put things back where they belonged. The official version the inquest was held quietly, with none of the drama some villagers had expected, and others secretly desired. Sergeant Reeves presented the evidence with careful clarity. The sedative in Lydia Fairclough's system, the access doctor. Hawthorne had to it the timing of his visit and the altered hospital records from years before. The coroner's verdict was precise. Death by misadventure, induced by criminal negligence. Miss Marple approved of the wording. It acknowledged both the method and the intent without sensationalism. Dr. Hawthorne did not contest the findings. He sat pale and composed, hands folded, as though accepting at last a diagnosis long delayed. Arthur Bell's inheritance. Arthur Bell remained in Greythorn Hollow for several weeks after the inquest, sorting through his aunt's belongings. Miss Marple encountered him one afternoon outside Rosevale Cottage, where the shutters had finally been opened. She meant to tell me everything, he said quietly, about my mother, about the past. Yes, Miss Marple said she was very brave, your aunt, braver than she believed herself to be. Arthur nodded. I think the singing helped her. It often does, Miss Marple replied. People sing when words are not quite enough. Arthur inherited the cottage after all, once the charitable bequests were honoured. He decided to keep it, not as a shrine, but as a home. She wouldn't have wanted it to stay empty, he said. Miss Marple thought that sounded exactly right. Mr. Quince's relief, Harold Quince, returned slowly to his old habits. The legacy, he announced, would be donated to the same widow's trust Lydia Fairclough had established. It was never meant for me. He told Miss Marple earnestly. No, she agreed. It was meant to thank you for saying no. He blinked. I've never thought of it that way. Miss Marple smiled. No one ever does at first. Mrs. Linton reconsiders. Mrs. Beatrice Linton, though outwardly unchanged, seemed marginally quieter. I suppose, she said stiffly to Miss Marple one afternoon, one can misjudge people. Yes. Miss Marple said gently, especially those who don't advertise their courage. Mrs. Linton sniffed, but did not disagree. The song's meaning on Miss Marple's final evening in Greythorn Hollow. Mrs. Banting brewed a particularly careful pot of tea. I must say, Jane, she remarked, I shall never think of singing the same way again. No, Miss Marple agreed. It can be a form of confession or preparation. She gazed out of the window towards Rosevale Cottage, now softly lit. Lydia Fairclough's song had not been a lament. It had been an announcement, to herself, if no one else, that she would no longer be silent. Miss Marple reflects as she packed her suitcase the next morning. Miss Marple reflected, as she so often did, on the smallness of villages and the largeness of human conscience. People liked to believe that evil arrived dramatically, with raised voices and violent acts. But more often it came quietly, disguised as kindness, fear, or the desire to keep one's good name intact. And courage, she thought, was equally quiet. It sang at midnight, when no one was meant to be listening. Departure. Miss Marple left Greythorn Hollow as she had arrived. Done, remarked upon by most, warmly farewelled by a few. At the station, Mrs. Banting pressed a parcel of seed cake into her hands. For the journey, she said. And Jane, do come back sometime. Miss Marple smiled. If there is singing, she said, I shall be sure to listen. As the train pulled away, Greythorn Hollow settled once more into its gentle rhythms. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the village, though changed, was at peace. Epilogue. That winter Arthur Bell planted roses in the garden at Rosevale Cottage, pale ones, quiet ones. and sometimes, when the wind was just right, it seemed to carry a tune across the green, not sorrowful, not fearful, but complete. Miss Jane Marple, hearing of it later, smiled to herself. Some songs, she knew, did not end with the singer. They ended when they were finally understood,